Hello friends, in today's video I'm going to be taking you through 3 beginner-friendly embroidery tutorials that I think are just perfect for the fall season, or autumn as many people call it. There's something about fall that just makes me feel so creative, and I know I'm not the only one. So if you've been itching to do some crafting lately, I hope these tutorials can help you scratch that itch. I hope you enjoy this video, and don't forget to leave me a like if you find these tutorials helpful. It really does help me out with the YouTube algorithm gods. The first embroidery tutorial we'll be going through is this fall inspired shoe embroidery design. I do recommend, if you're new to this and trying it for the first time, just completely unlace the shoes, take the laces all the way out. The method that I use though is I unlace it all the way down to the very bottom eyelets. Then I take the tongue and just tuck it underneath the toe cap at the front of the shoe. This keeps it out of the way and makes sure that I won't embroider onto it by accident. These are the colours that I'm going to be going in with on these shoes. I like to store my thread on these closed pegs, and then I write the DMC number. These are the needles that I always use when I'm embroidering onto shoes. Honestly, any embroidery needles will do. I just like to use these because I've had the best luck with them. I'll have these and all of the other supplies that I use in this video linked in the description below, just to make it easier for you to grab them yourself if you're trying a shoe embroidery project. If you are planning on trying out shoe embroidery, you are going to need finger protectors. The ones that I use are just silicone, and they make it easier for me to pull the needle through the fabric, and they also protect the skin on my fingertips. So I've gone ahead and I have threaded my needle here, ready to get stitching. I'll be using different numbers of strands throughout this project, and all of that information is listed in the shoe embroidery PDF that I have linked in the description. The first stitches I'm going to be doing are going to be for the larger flowers on the outsides of the shoes and also on the insides of the shoes. These stitches are lazy daisy stitches, but they're a lot larger than regular lazy daisy stitches that you might have seen before on smaller flowers. To stitch this big flower, I basically just go around in the shape of a semicircle, making sure all of the petals are a very similar size. I also don't sketch out anything on my shoes before I head in and embroider. This is just because I stitch from memory. I've been embroidering this design for the past 5 years, so it's all just kind of muscle memory at this point. However, within the PDFs that I sell, I do go into detail on how to sketch this design out with an erasable marker so that your finished product will end up just like the finished clips of these shoes that I embroidered. The key to a great lazy daisy stitch is to get the perfect amount of tension on the thread. As you can see, I just create a loose loop and then I go back in with an anchor stitch. You should never be putting too much tension on the lazy daisy stitch with the anchor stitch, because if you do, what it'll do is just suck those two stitches together very tightly, and that's not what you want. That's not going to create a petal shape, that's just going to create one line basically. So to create the nice domed petal effect, you need to have the perfect amount of tension on your thread. Once you're done with the one big flower on the outside of the shoe, you're going to do exactly the same process with the smaller flower that sits a little bit further down on the shoe. You should end up with something like this on the outside of the shoes when you're done, and then we're going to move on to the insides of the shoes. We're going to be doing 2 7-petal flowers on either side of the Converse logo. These are going to be a similar size to the smaller flower you did on the outside of the shoes. Again, making sure to keep the perfect tension on these stitches so that they turn out just like this. So once I'm done with all of the larger lazy daisy stitches on this one shoe, I'm going to move on to the next shoe and repeat the entire process on both the outsides and the insides of the other shoe. Now I'm going to go back in and stitch some smaller accent flowers. I'm using the same rust color for these, and I'm also using the same stitch. I'm using the lazy daisy stitch, but this time they're going to be much smaller because I'm making small little accent flowers that are supposed to look like daisies. Another tip for stitching the lazy daisy stitch would be to not be afraid to go back in once you have anchored the stitch. Go back in with your needle just to fix the shape if you have to. So we have 2 of these smaller daisies on the outsides of the shoes, and then we also have 2 on the insides of the shoes. Here I'm just showing you how I tie off and secure the thread within the shoe once I'm done with a certain stitch. I usually loop the thread through some of the inner stitches a couple of times before double knotting it and then snipping off the excess. On the outside, one sits above the larger flower and then the other one sits between the larger flower and the smaller flower. And on the insides of the shoes, I stitch each flower to sit perfectly between the two larger flowers we did earlier. This is what I'm left with after I finished the smaller accent flowers on both the inside and the outside of both shoes. I'm going to be using this colour for both the pollen of the flowers that we've already stitched, and I'm also going to be using the same colour for the roses that I'm going to stitch between the smaller flowers and the larger flowers. To stitch the pollen on the inside of the flowers that we've already stitched, I'm going to be making some French knot stitches. Next, we're moving on to the roses, and we get to use the woven wheel stitch for the roses. I think it's called different things all over the internet, but I learned it as the woven wheel. Basically, we're going to stitch 5 spokes in a wheel, all meeting at the center, just using straight stitches for these and try and keep them the same size. Again, if you are using my PDF embroidery guide, all of this information will be listed there, as well as exact sizes for stitches and exact sizes of the sketches that you'll be following. Once you've stitched the 5 spokes, we're going to bring the needle back up through the shoe fabric, and we're going to start weaving the needle underneath the stitches that we just made. So let's number these stitches: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. If you weave the needle under number 1, you're going to skip number 2 and then weave it under number 3, skip number 4, weave it under number 5, and just keep going in that fashion. So then you would skip number 1, weave it under number 2, skip number 3, weave it under number 4, and this is going to leave you with a really cool woven texture with the thread, and we're just going to keep going until you can't see those wheel spokes anymore. Here's a close-up of what I'm left with after I'm done with both sides of both shoes. Now I'm going to go in with a lighter sage colour. This bride did want forest green for her greenery, so by using the lighter sage for the smaller leaves, I'm kind of going for a bit of contrast here with the greenery. These smaller leaves, I just use a straight stitch and I make 5 leaves for each one of them, kind of angling the leaves and converging them to meet at one place. I'm going to be stitching 6 of these leaves onto the outsides of the shoes. And then I make 5 of these leaves as well on the insides of the shoes. Our vines are going to be growing from these leaves, so I just place them in kind of strategic spots. And then this is what I'm left with when I'm done with the smaller leaves on the insides and the outsides of both shoes. After I'm done with those smaller leaves, I'm going to go back in and add the vines that grow from those leaves. I'm going to be using the forest green that the bride requested for these. And again, we're going to be using more lazy daisy stitches, so remember what I said about the tension on the thread. I am using a slightly higher thread count for these than I did on the lazy daisy stitches for the flowers on this design, just because I want them to stand out a little bit more. I always do that on this specific design. So on the outsides of the shoes there are 5 of these vines, all of like varying lengths. And on the insides of the shoes I add 4 of these vines. This is what I'm left with after I finish all of the vines on both of the shoes. Now I'm going back in with the white thread that I showed you at the very beginning of this video, and I'm just adding some really small accents near the smaller leaves. I'm doing some French knots for these stitches, basically just to look like smaller flowers growing out of those leaves. And I add quite a few of those to the outsides of the shoes and to the insides of the shoes. The best tip I can give you for good French knots is to keep tension on the thread as you're pulling it through the shoe. Something that's highly requested all the time on all of my videos is that I show the insides of the shoes. So here's a quick clip of that. As you can see, the stitches are really neat and tidy on the insides. There's no loose threads hanging anywhere, no huge lumps of thread that you would feel if you were wearing the shoes. Now all that's left is to lace up the shoes and get them ready to take photos. I always love how this design turns out, especially when I'm able to do a full themed colour scheme. I'm really loving the dark green of the vines and the rust coloured larger flowers. The next tutorial we'll be going through is a cottagecore inspired embroidery design on a cotton son de fleur dress. I recently did a giveaway collaboration with them, and the winner of that giveaway chose this dress for me to embroider onto, and today I'm going to show you the process. Firstly, I just want to say how cute all of the packaging is that they use at Son de Fleur. It really feels like you're opening like a Christmas present or something whenever you open one of their packages. This dress is such a lovely creamy linen colour, so I wanted to use more of a neutral colour scheme, and as always I will have all of the supplies that I used linked in the description of this video. If you want to try this project yourself at home, I definitely recommend using an embroidery hoop. It just keeps the fabric more taut when you're working, and it makes the embroidery more neat in the end, because when you work on thinner fabric, it can be easy for the fabric to pucker and distort underneath the thread if you pull too hard or something like that. The first stitch I'm going to go in with is just several kind of inch long straight stitches. I guess they could also be considered like inch long back stitches. I do 3 of those all the way down to like the waist hem of the dress, because I kind of want it to look like there's flowers growing up from the waist. Sounds kind of weird, but bear with me. I then go back in on this stem and I make a bunch of little anchor stitches. I don't know why, I just have always preferred to use this method rather than a bunch of smaller back stitches or straight stitches. Once I'm happy with the amount of anchors I've put in, I then go back to the top of the stem and start to weave the needle through each of those anchor stitches. This kind of gives the stem like a 3D effect, makes it stand out from the fabric a little bit, and it also makes the stitching look much more seamless, as if it is really a stem. I'm going to add 2 kind of bulky-ish leaves to the bottom of this stem, and I add about 6 or 7 straight stitches, all kind of like bunched in the same place. I'm gonna go in and add like a little offshoot off of this stem for another little flower to be growing right there. I'm going to show you exactly how I tie off and secure my thread. I just loop it within the inside stitches a couple of times, maybe 2 or 3 times, and then I make 2 knots. I always get asked if I back my stitches with anything, and honestly, if you tie them off properly, you don't need to back your stitches with anything, even in shoes. And this dress that's going to be worn by the giveaway winner, these stitches will hold with this method. So I repeat the same method for the other 2 stems that I'm doing in this same color. I'm kind of varying the heights because I want a little bit of variation. I think it makes it look more realistic. So I've done one smaller stem and then another slightly larger stem on the other side with an offshoot. And now it's time to go in and add some flowers to these stems. I'm just going in with some regular white thread, and I'm going to create 5 petals growing upwards towards the sun. And then on the smaller offshoots, I'll only be adding 3 petals. But for these petals, it's basically the same stitch as what we did for the larger leaves at the bottom of the stems. You're just going over the same area with the same straight stitch until basically you can't see the material of the dress through the stitches. It's going to look kind of 3D and kind of like a petal, hopefully. Once I'm done stitching the petals for those white flowers, I now have to go in and stitch the pollen. I'm going to be using this neutral brown colour, and I'm going to be making a handful of French knots right where the pollen would be on a regular flower. So on the bigger flowers, I make about 4 or 5 French knots, and on the smaller ones, I just make 1 French knot. My tip for great French knots is to keep your thumb on the excess of thread as you are pulling it through the fabric to create the knot. By keeping tension, you prevent any unwanted knots in the thread, and it makes the French knots really neat and tidy. Okay, once we're done with those daisy looking flowers, I'm going to go in and start stitching some more stems. There's going to be a lot of stems in this video, and we're using the same technique for all of them, which hopefully makes this a little bit easier if you are attempting this project at home. I'm going in with the same colour that I used for the French knots on the daisies. Once I'm done stitching all of these brown stems, I'm going to go in and add some leaves to them. I'm using a slightly lighter green, and I'm not adding any flowers to these. These are just going to be leaves and stems. Again, we're using that same repetitive straight back and forth stitch that we used for the larger leaves on the other stems and for the flower petals for the white flowers. We're not using any super fancy stitches in this tutorial, so hopefully you will be able to recreate this at home if you want to. I'm not adding too many leaves to these stems. I don't want this design to look too busy, so I'm adding around 4 or 5 leaves to each of these brown stems, and I'm calling it a day for those. Once I'm happy with the leaves on those brown stems, I'm going in with one of my last stitches of the day, which is You guessed it, some more stems. We are stitching in a lighter color now, and we're making some much smaller stems to kind of just fill in the little areas between the flowers and the stems that we just stitched. On these little stems, I am going in and adding a couple of really tiny branches, and you'll see why in a minute. We're going to add a couple of accents to those. Once you've added in all of your little mini stems, we're gonna go back in and make some French knots in that same white thread that we used for the daisies. Don't forget to keep your thread taut when you're pulling these through the fabric. It really makes a lot of difference, and the French knots will be so neat and tidy. I add 2 or 3 French knots to each of the tips of the little branches that we made. I think this kind of looks like a cotton plant, and it's the perfect little addition to the little areas that needed filling. And there we have it. Here is the finished product. I really hope the giveaway winner is happy with this dress. I love how it turned out. I think I might need to make myself one. I hope that this video gave you all the tools that you might need to recreate this kind of project at home. And I highly recommend working on a Sunday floor dress if you do want to try this project yourself. They are such high quality, and I know that this dress that I embroidered will last for years and years, which is really what you want when you put a lot of time and effort into a project like this. So yeah, I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave me a like and maybe leave me a comment. I make lots of videos based around embroidery, shoe embroidery mostly, so if that seems like it might be up your alley, then definitely consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks again for watching, and I really hope to see you in my next video. The last tutorial I'm going to take you through is another shoe embroidery design, but this one uses one of my DIY shoe embroidery kits, so it's a different method than the first tutorial in this video. This is going to be an in-depth video tutorial for my embroidery kit number 3, the third kit in a range I've been designing for beginners to learn embroidery on shoes. If you don't already have a kit, check out the links in the description of this video so you can snag one of your own. For this video, I'm going to be using a light brown pair of Converse All-Stars. Please note that this specific kit has been designed for use on high-top Converse shoes. The number 3 embroidery kit, like all of my other kits, will come with all of the tools you need to complete this specific design, including the embroidery needles, finger protectors, and the water-soluble stickers that you can see me adhering to the shoes here. The larger, longer stickers go on the outer areas of the shoes. It's totally up to you if you want to line the design up with the sole of the shoe. I personally prefer the flowers to be sitting a little above the sole line of the shoe. A quick tip I've learned after working with these stickers is to make sure of the placement before actually sticking them down, because once they've been stuck down once and you try to move them to a different spot, they become way less tacky and harder to work with. Once you've got your stickers stuck down, it's time to prep the shoe for embroidery. I'm using a pair of my own Converse for this video, so please forgive how worn they are. I just ended up really liking this design and had to embroider it on a pair of my own Chucks. Unlace the shoes and tuck the tongue underneath the toe cap at the front of the shoe. Now, you could remove the laces altogether, but I like to loosely knot them and tuck them in alongside the tongue so they're out of the way. Now it's time to choose your thread. We'll be embroidering the stems and leaves on the outside of the shoe first, so I've chosen a warm green colour. I'll be using 2 strands of thread for both the leaves and the stems, so I've sectioned 2 smaller strands away from the remaining 4 in the skein. Almost all embroidery skeins come with 6 strands of thread. Next, thread your number 10 needle. This is the largest in the pack that comes included in the embroidery kit. Remember to double knot the end of your thread so it doesn't pull through the fabric. Don't forget your finger protector. We'll be doing a simple back stitch for the straight flower stems, but a lot of the curved areas, like the off-shooting branches, will look best if you use a couch stitch, which I'll explain in just a second. Use a satin stitch, just going back and forth, to fill the leaves, making sure to fill the entire outlined area so that they look full. To make a couch stitch for the curved lines of the branches and stems, make a simple straight stitch from one end of the branch to the other. Instead of pulling it tight in a straight line, leave it a little slack and stick your needle up through the point at which you want it to curve. Loop your needle through the thread that you left slack and pull toward where you want the curve to be created. You can also add in additional couch stitches in order to perfect the curve along the line of the branch. I'll be going back in with a lighter green colour, so I'm going to be skipping the next flower stem and moving on to the next one. The key to really full looking leaves is to fill the outline completely. I found it took 5 or 6 satin stitches to get them to where I wanted them to be. There are some small sprigs that don't have any leaves on them. We'll be adding some smaller accents to them later, so don't forget to stitch them onto the stems and branches. Remember, if your thread gets a little tangled, don't yank on your needle and thread. Find the tangle and gently pull it in the opposite direction and it'll usually come free. I'm leaving one leaf bare on this stem because I wanted to use the other green to make the design a little less uniform. This is totally optional, and of course you don't have to use a different colour green at all if you don't want to. Once you're done with this colour, you should be left with something like this. We're going to go ahead and loop the needle through the closest inner stitch we can find. Do this twice and then twice more, but turn those loops into knots before cutting off the excess thread. I'm going to go back in with a much lighter green, 2 strands of it, for the remaining stems and leaves. I'll be using the number 10 needle again, and as always, don't forget to double knot the end of your thread. Just like with the first colour, we'll be using a satin stitch for the leaves, a back stitch for the straight stems, and a couch stitch for the curved stems and branches. You don't have to use a couch stitch, you can just go in with a regular back stitch and curve it along the line. I just prefer the way the curved branches look with a couch stitch. Don't forget to embroider the leaf we left out on the second to last stem. Make sure to tie off and secure your thread on the inner stitches when you're finished with your lighter green. Next, we're going to move on to the flower embroidery. I chose a warm yellow for the first of my flower colours. We'll be using the same needle and 3 strands of thread for all of the flowers. We'll be using a lazy daisy stitch for the flower petals, but if this sounds too difficult, you can always just use a satin stitch to fill the space instead. For the lazy daisy stitch, start at the center of the flower, pulling the needle up through the shoe and stick it back through in almost exactly the same spot, but don't pull the thread taut yet. Pull the needle up through the shoe at the tip of the petal you're working on. Loop your needle through the excess of thread that you left, pulling gently to make the thread taut before sticking it back through the shoe and creating your petal. Repeat this process for the rest of the petals on this flower. We're then going to skip a couple flowers and do a couple more lazy daisy stitches on this half flower right here. Finish off your petals before securing and tying off the thread inside the shoe. Next, I'm going to go in with 3 strands of this lavender colour on this flower. This will be the only flower I use this colour on. Again, I'm using the number 10 needle and I'm double knotting the end of my thread. Secure and tie off your thread before picking your last flower colour. I'm going in with a light pink for the remaining flowers, and we're also going to be using this colour for the small accents I mentioned earlier. Remember those mini branches we made? We'll be using this colour to add accents to those. For the small accents at the ends of the branches, stick your needle up through the fabric at the end of the branch, pull the thread through and loop the thread around the needle twice before sticking the needle back through the fabric. Keep a thumb on the thread as you pull it through to keep the French knot tight and tidy. This is known as a French knot stitch. I find it easier to do the knots as I go rather than completing the pink flowers and going back for the knots. Secure and tie off the pink thread before choosing the colour for the middle of the flowers, or the pollen area. I decided to go in with a warm brown, and again we're going to be using 3 strands of the thread and the number 10 needle. We'll be doing French knots again for the pollen of the flowers. Keep your French knots tight by controlling your thread with your thumb as it travels back through the shoe. Once you're done with your French knots, you should have a final result like this. Tie off and secure your thread. Don't underestimate how important this step is. You want your embroidery to last. Now we're going to start on the inner embroidery design. I'll be going in with 2 strands of the darker green I used on the outside of the shoe. I already had 2 strands left over from the outer shoe embroidery, so I didn't have to split more thread, but remember, 2 strands. We'll be using the number 10 needle again. Use a combination of simple back stitches and couch stitches on the stem area, and a satin stitch to fill the leaves as you travel down the stem. I originally placed this sticker in the wrong spot, so I relocated it here, and as you can see, there's a little bit more lifting at the edges because it lost some of its adhesiveness. I'm leaving a few leaves bare of thread because I'll be going back in with the lighter green for those ones. Tie off and secure your thread on the nearest inner stitches. Remember to double knot. Go in with your lighter green, 2 strands of it, and fill the remaining leaves with a satin stitch. Tie off and secure your thread. Next we'll go in with the colour we want to use for the flower between the vines. I wanted to use this yellow that I used on the outside of the shoe. Once you've finished your lazy daisy stitches, use the same colour to accent the smaller branches around the leaves. You should be left with something like this. For our last stitch, we'll go back in with 3 strands of our chosen pollen colour and create 1 French knot in the centre of the flower. Tie off and secure your thread before admiring all of your hard work. Don't spend too much time admiring though, we still have the water-soluble stickers to remove. Grab yourself a warm bowl of water. This process can also be done at a sink, but please do not submerge the whole shoe in water. I used a microfiber towel which worked really well in picking up small pieces of the disintegrating sticker. Dampen the entire embroidery area and gently move the towel over the excess sticker. Don't scrub at it, but don't be too careful because the embroidery is a lot more secure than it looks. Remember how many times we tied it off? This process took me about 15 minutes to totally remove the sticker and make it dissolve completely. I found that completely saturating the fabric and letting the water do most of the work was the best approach. I also took the towel and dampened the entire outer shoe area to avoid harsh water lines once the shoes were dry. After you've removed all traces of the soluble sticker, leave the shoes to dry in a well-ventilated space for 12 to 24 hours. If you're worried about getting your shoes dirty, you can always spray them with waterproof shoe protector. I don't ever recommend machine washing. Spot cleaning with a damp towel is the best way to go with hand embroidered shoes. And you're all done. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already snagged a kit, I'll have them linked in the description below. Subscribe and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any of my upcoming embroidery content. Thanks for watching.